Alright, we're going to pull apart this Airhead transmission here. This is exactly the condition I received it in. It hasn't been cleaned in any way. As I showed on the final drive video that I did, I prefer to clean these things after they've come out of the oven the first time so the solvent doesn't fume up the shop too badly. So we're just going to get this thing apart and then deal with it from there. He's in for a circlip groove, so first thing we want to do is turn this guy, and he's pretty stiff. So we'll probably find that that bearing has shifted off the front of there. But the first thing we can do to find out is just to go ahead and loosen these cover bolts. And if the flange frees up when the cover bolts get loose, then you'll know that that bearing has started to move, because you're basically relieving the excess preload on it. And he freed up a lot. So we're definitely going to find that bearing is shifted once we crack it open. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and get this flange off. We're going to do as much as we can. We're going to take as much stuff off as possible before it goes into the oven. Big old 24mm socket. Big old cheater pipe on here. They go in this bits box. Sometimes these guys come off pretty easily. Generally it's a bit more, yeah, he's not going to come off easily. Actually, there he goes. And there's our flange. It's not oily on the inside. It's hard to say why they come off tight sometimes and not others. Looks like this might be an originally assembled transmission. There's usually 2 wave washers on this one bolt, and this one still has them. A lot of rebuilders don't put them both back in. And you can see all of the grime down here. Certainly he has a leaky neutral switch. So we're going to be replacing that. While we're at it, we can just pop out the fill plug. And then he's going to go in the oven now. We'll see him again in another hour. All right, we're back opening up this transmission. Take it out of the oven right here. Hot, ready to pull the cover off. This is the BMW cover tool. This transmission has one of the older yellow gaskets on it, and the gasket's going to shred. It comes apart, and sure enough it does. Looks kind of typical. These are the shims. We're just going to toss them in the drain pan. Shift rod's going to go in the drain pan. Input shaft comes out on these. This is the latest version with the 39mm coupler. So while it's hot, we take out the screws holding the shift mechanism in place. Doing this while the transmission is hot means that the aluminum is as relaxed as it can be around these shoulder bolts. Obviously it's a new style with a shift kit, plastic detent roller, looks okay. 3/4 shift cam that doesn't look loose. Shift forks come out. And here's the case. There's just a little bit of oil in there. We can invert them over this one. Let the input shaft bearing fall out. And that's pretty much the empty case. We're going to leave him upside down in this drain pan to drain for a while. We're going to let these cool down, but just to confirm, yes, there's no circlip on this shaft. You can see the axial play in this gear that comes from not having the circlip, and the bearing then has shifted. Nothing feels very bad, nothing really looks very bad, but we're going to let these parts cool down and we'll wash them off before we give them a good inspection. So now we're going to press the output shaft apart. Pressing this off using the first gear. That way, if I want to keep the bearing, I haven't put a side load on it. And then we're going to put the bearing splitter around the 5th gear. And that way we pull all of that off together as well. Okay, now we're just going to get snap ring pliers and pull this gear off, and then the output shaft will be ready for machining once we get the 2nd gear bushing out of place. Okay, so we just get these snap rings off here. To get this bushing off, sometimes they slide off by hand on the older bikes, but the newer ones is pretty unusual. This one isn't really sliding all that much. So what I'm going to do is use the old standby, a little bit of heat, and if it doesn't drop, then we'll use a gear to tap it down. Started to move there, but we're just gonna and now we have the whole output shaft ready to throw into the lathe to cut the circlip groove. Lock down the table. And we're done. See the groove right there. Okay, we're going to look at some of the parts that we have inside this transmission. Over here is the shift mechanism with the forks and the rod. We're just going to take a look at the shift mech itself here. One of the things that can happen is the 3/4 shift cam can come uncoupled from the gear that drives it in back. We've got an example of one of those right here, and you can see that the gear on the back is has separated. It can move a little bit and actually slide back and forth. That's repairable, but a lot of them are riding around with this problem without any real manifestation, but it's something that we don't want to put back inside a customer bike. This one doesn't have the problem. The plastic shift roller, there are a lot of opinions on whether that's something that should be replaced with a metal roller or bearing or not. There was a while when I replaced a lot of them with metal. Sometimes you see them that are either broken or very distorted. These are all of the output shaft parts here. We pulled it apart. You saw that we circlipped the output shaft. One thing you always want to check is that the 5th gear is a good fit on the shaft, and you try to rock it a little bit. A little bit of rock's okay. Sometimes it's excessive, and we replace the shaft. In this case, there's a tiny bit of wear, which is completely normal, but he's also getting a tall 5th gear, which, being a new gear, is going to be even tighter than his old one was. So we certainly don't need to do anything for him. Taper looks good. There's no damage to the shaft anywhere. You can take a look at all of the individual gears and look at their shift dogs, and there's a normal amount of wear on these shift dogs here, but nothing that's unusual or problematic. So those parts all look good. The intermediate shaft also looks good. This is the part right here that breaks on the older ones. This groove is wider. This is on the mid-70s ones. This groove is wider, and so this flange here is much narrower, and these dogs can actually just break off. This is a later design. There were at least 3 versions of this output shaft, of this intermediate shaft used. Everything here looks great. You always want to check the helical teeth for pitting, and none of these helical teeth have any signs of pitting at all. It looks good. There is some rust underneath the plastic layer on this bearing shield, which tells me that there has been moisture in this transmission. The bearings feel okay, but because it's a 70,000 mile transmission, we're going to go ahead and replace them all anyway. And here's the input shaft with the roller bearing that goes in the front of the transmission. Again, in the late 70s, sometimes this gear would crack. It's been redesigned several times. The bearing on the back, again, feels okay, but because it's a 70,000 mile transmission, that's obviously had signs of some, not standing water in the transmission, but moisture, we're going to go ahead and replace them. So from here, we're going to head over to the press and pull off these remaining bearings and press on new ones. All right, we're going to start pressing this stuff apart, starting with the input shaft. This gear has been modified to allow the oil shield to be not damaged. Those shields are, for whatever reason, no longer available. I already installed the bushing and the first set of circlips on this, so we can go ahead and reassemble the output shaft right here at the press. Just going to get a little bit of oil. These parts here.
Clamp.
Make sure you can spin freely. Alright, we're going to drop the shafts back into the transmission housing. Not much new to show you here, except that I took the bolts that are going to hold the shift mechanism in, and I put some sealant around the base. This is something I always do. It's one of the things I have to prep before we drop the shafts in, because I try to keep everything moving pretty quickly once it goes in. So I'm going to pull the case out of the oven. Try to get through this pretty quickly. Drop in 2 of our dust seals. Drop in the input bearing. We're going to need a shift fork on the output shaft. Sorry, intermediate shaft. Drop those 2 guys in. Actually, you can do these after the input shaft's in. Just go in, gonna put a tiny bit of oil on the rod. At this point, the shift mechanism goes into place. And then holding everything in place with one hand. And that's the fully assembled bottom half of our transmission. Now he's going to cool down, and we're going to take our measurements for the shimming. We're going to use him when we're done, but just so you can see where he goes, he's going to sit on top of there. While we're at it, I'm going to show you that we're going to put the seal in the cover, which is something I usually don't do at this point, but there's a reason to. So I'm just going to do it while we're on the video. When used on a paralever model, this vent notch that's up here at the top needs to be sealed off. On the monolevers, that's used as a breather passage, but it doesn't apply to the paralevers, and so that gets sealed off. So I'm going to put the seal in now just because we can. This is a tool I hardly ever use. BMW makes this ridiculous seal installer. Normally I put the seal in afterward, but I'm going to go ahead and use it now. This is the Teflon lipped seal. It's a really good seal. If you look at the original one that was on here, it's an older design, and one thing I often find on these older ones is that this the Teflon layer delaminates from the plastic carrier. So sometimes I'll get a transmission that has a really bad output seal leak, and this this whole layer has just come off and it's leaking out underneath it. So we're just going to pop him down over the seal, make some noise. I think I'm going to put him in the press. And there's our seal. And so I'm just going to take a bit of Yama Bond. I'm just going to just put a drop of it right onto that area. And then it's going to let him sit. He'll soak in, he's going to shrink, and he's going to seal that up nicely. And once this is cool, we're going to measure for shims, and then throw the cover back on, and then we're done. Alright, hopefully we're going to button up this transmission here in one shot. This is the measurement plate. This is my John Shea measurement plate that's sitting on the transmission here. You can see that it holds the shafts in place. And then using the depth micrometer, you can measure from the you can measure down to the clamping surface and then down to the bearing surface, and you compare them to find out how high the bearings are sticking up above the case. You do the same measuring the pocket depths in the cover, perform calculations sort of like we did on the final drive if you watched that video, and then you find out how you have to shim it to get the end play that you're looking for. And here's a collection of shims. Usually the shims that I take out of a transmission go back into the shim pile. In this case, I've already calculated the shims that I need for this, and so I'm ready to go ahead, pull off the plate. We'll take our shim plate off. We can pack up the shims, get them out of the way. Here are the shims that we've measured and identified, so they're going to go on the input shaft, the intermediate shaft, and the output shaft. And then we're going to throw the cover on him. The cover has been in the oven heating up, so he's all ready to go. One thing that's worth mentioning before we put the cover on, because we've already put the seal into the cover, we want to make sure that the taper is very clean. I've already cleaned the taper that's in the flange, but you want to make sure that the taper is completely clean and dry so that there's no oily residue or no dirt or anything that comes off. And I've already wiped it with a solvent, and now we're just giving it a wipe with a clean piece of tissue paper to make sure that there's no residue on there at all. If you don't have the cover, if you don't have the seal installed in the cover already, it's pretty easy to get in and clean it with the cover in place. But we already put the seal in there, so it's much easier to access this now. You can see the sealant that we applied down there sealing off the triangular notch. Then you always give the input shaft a smack, drive him back into the cover. Now we're ready to put on our flange. This is clean, taper's clean. Just going to push him into place with a slight turning motion. Start the nut and washer. And we're definitely going to need our big cheater bar on this one. because this gets 220 Newton meters. $100, $150, $180, $204. There's our 220. Now all we have to do is tap a couple of seals in. Input shaft seal. Here's the input seal driver. In the shifter seal, we still have to put in our spherical bearing that we took out to clean everything. Just going to tap him in. To the bottom. Here's our input seal driver. We will go ahead and throw the shifter in here. Fill plug, we're going to leave him in loose, because obviously the owner is going to take him out to fill him up. Drain plug, we're going to put him in tight. And we're going to put in new neutral switch that's been sealed with epoxy. So hopefully this one won't leak on him. And there you are. Completed transmission. I'm still going to test shift it before I send it back to the guy and pop in the speedometer gear and the sleeve, but they're trivial. We're done. Talk to you later.